Inclusive and sustainable development with coordinated reforms across a broad range of areas to address constraints to reducing poverty and inequality. According to the World Bank's group new Systematic Country Diagnostic for South Africa released today, progress has been made since 1994 to address the legacy of exclusion in this country, but much more still needs to be done. To discuss how we can maximize development impact and to tackle the growth that we so desperately need, we're now joined by World Bank Senior Economist Marek Hanusch in studio. Marek, good evening to you and thank you for your time. The report, of course, was prepared with extensive consultation from relevant stakeholders, so it's an all-encompassing look at where we are in South Africa at the moment.
That's right, Bongani. We had a relationship with the National Planning Commission, but we also consulted much more widely. We consulted with government, the private sector. We traveled the whole country to talk to South Africans. We talked to youth. We went to townships. We talked to members of the union movement. We really tried to talk to everyone and get a perspective on what are the issues that face South Africa and how can we tackle poverty and inequality. As you know, poverty and inequality, reducing those are at the core of the mission of the World Bank Group.
All right, so give it to us. Is the patient sick or healthy or on its way to ICU? What does the picture looking like?
I like your analogy. We use that analogy a lot, actually, to say a systematic country diagnostic. It's like when you go to the doctor and you have a physical exam and the disease is poverty and inequality. So that is what our book does to look at that. And we weren't the only doctors. All South Africans who participated were the doctors. Is South Africa sick? Well, it is the most unequal country in the world and poverty is very high for a middle-income country. So in that sense, there is a disease. But we are on track to make progress. And there are ways in which progress can be further accelerated, and that is what we discuss in our report.
You also suggest a range of policy interventions that are going to be needed to eliminate poverty and the inequality that you are talking about. What are some of the urgent steps that must be taken before it's too late?
So Bongani, we always take a very long-term vision. We believe that the constraints in South Africa are very much structural. The book is entitled An Incomplete Transition, Overcoming the Legacy of Exclusion. What we say is since 1994, a lot of progress has been made. There was a successful political transition, but an economic transition requires that more South Africans participate in the economy, and that requires a lot of structural policies. Now, what are the important ones here? It's not going to surprise any South Africans if I say that, but skills are critically important. Maybe the most important constraint in South Africa is that not enough people have a tertiary education degree. So getting free tertiary education right and making sure that poor South Africans really benefit from that is critically important. Another one that is really important on the education front is basic education, to make sure that people actually qualify to go to university. And another one is technical and vocational training. That is particularly important for poor South Africans. Not everybody can go to university, so getting that right and involving the private sector more to make sure you get the skills that the private sector needs is really important.
I mean, it's a particularly challenging one because, of course, on almost every major index that looks at these things, South Africa's education system typically tends to trail most of the developing and developed nations. We all understand the issue of economic freedom. We understand that with political and civil rights, we didn't necessarily get that. And it's a question that you'll no doubt be aware South Africans have been grappling with for quite some time now. And there is a view around quick gains that can be made. But as you say, long-term, strategically, what do we need to do to get to that point of economic transition and inclusion?
So the one thing that is already ongoing is to tackle state capture. The new administration has made tremendous progress on that one. And if you get government to focus again on the development challenges rather than being sidetracked, then you can put a system in motion that tackles these challenges. So we believe that is a really important one. Other than that, I think that really, as I said earlier, getting free tertiary education right, that is the challenge at the moment, which can have a huge impact and is also going to help build the social contract. Because the way for poor South Africans to get into the middle class is through universities, so you help build a social contract.
I was curious to note that one of the constraints your report identifies is this issue of the skewed distribution of land and assets. And from the World Bank's point of view, where does our current conversation around land expropriation without compensation come in?
So we understand very well where that comes from. To us, this is a symptom of an incomplete transition. People are no longer patient and people don't want to wait anymore for the legacy of the past to be undone. But there are ways in which you do this that doesn't damage the rest of the economy. We believe that expropriation without compensation is dangerous. And there are ways in which you can do land reform without necessarily undermining food security and investment. It's no done deal yet. It's not necessarily going to happen, and I know
the President has made assurances that food security will remain foremost in his mind, certainly. They've said that they're not going to scare away investors. In fact, is on an investment drive to try and bring, what, $100 billion to the South African economy in the next 5 years. Is that double speak, though? Is it speaking with a forked tongue to say all of that and then go after land without compensation?
Well, I think we have to see what they propose. I agree with you, it's going to be difficult, but maybe it's not impossible, and we are curious to see what the proposals are going to be.
But what concerns you about the messaging that you've heard so far? I accept that you say it's not a done deal. From what you've heard, what are your concerns?
So property rights are extremely important for investors. What we stress in our report is that South Africa gets relatively little foreign direct investment compared to other emerging markets, not necessarily compared to the rest of Africa, but compared to other emerging markets. It gets a lot of portfolio investment. Now, why is that? Because portfolio investment is short term. When you get nervous, you take the money out again. But foreign direct investment is for the long haul. So if you're worried about property rights and property security, you may not want to invest. And I believe, or we believe, that low foreign direct investment in South Africa is a symptom of that, and we think that is very risky.
And of course, when you talk about creating jobs, you also in your report indicate that it's not just government's role alone, but the private sector needs to be involved a lot more than it has.
Yes, that is right. And the private sector has to be involved in many ways. One is in policy formulation. Consult with the private sector. What are the potential impacts on the private sector? And this is really the best way of unleashing the potential of the private sector. The private sector can also help, I mentioned education earlier, bring in the private sector to ensure that your curriculum produces the skills that the private sector needs is critically important, and more can be done. But the private sector can also help on service delivery, public-private partnerships and the like. The private sector can play a huge role helping deliver services to South Africans.
Well, so the patient isn't entirely in ICU, but a lot needs to be done to get back to the road to health. Thank you very much. That was, of course, World Bank Senior Economist Marek Hanusch in the studio with us. Stay with us. We've got a quick break, after which Francis will be speaking to a Swiss banker about how to do business in that way. Stay with us.